My Triton Thickness Planer is the last large piece of machinery I do not have a permanent home for. On this channel I've built a cart for my DeWalt table saw and also a cart for my Triton sander and record bandsaw. It's taken me an age to work out what to do with the planer, and for a while the cluttered side benches have driven me wild. Eventually this is what I came up with, so stick around for the next few minutes and I'll show you how I built it. But first of all I needed to clear the bench. Much better. Right, let's get to work. First of all I need to envisage what the planer would look like set into the bench. I also wanted the planer table to be the same height as my workbench. Once I had all the dimensions established, I could then mark out the sizes that would create the hole in the centre of the workbench. And then for the rear corners, drill 2 holes with a Forstner bit. Then I could connect all the points with my Festool track saw. The cut towards me was a little tricky, so I made the cut in 2 parts, effectively making a hole that I could stand in to make the final cut. I cleaned the opening up with my Japanese pull saw and then run my router and my sander around to give it a nice crisp edge. Now I have to construct the supporting structure. These are made from 1.5 by 6 timbers. And once I'd clamped one in place, I could roll my workbench up to it to figure out the depth of the bar. I needed these to be at the correct size, so once my planer was suspended, the tables would fall down and be the same height as my workbench. Once I was happy, I could then take the timber to the table saw to cut it to the correct depth and then to the chop saw to cut it to the correct length. I then needed to work out where I was going to glue the packers onto the beams to make sure it fell in the right place so I could get a good mechanical fix. Now I had my bars completed, I could grovel under the bench. At this stage I'm not making a full fix, as I may need to tweak it later. Okay, let's make the bed of the frame. This is made out of 1x4s. And as my Festool crosscut station is set up for this thickness, I cut all the lengths there. And this is what the componentry looks like for the bed and for the front frame. All the connections are made with my Craig pocket hole jig. And as it's the best job in the workshop, I use all the corners with my small block plane. I can now lay the components out on my bench and clamp them together and then insert the pocket hole screws. And eventually make sure the whole thing is the correct length before fastening down the end fixings. Now I have the frame made, I know that my support bars are in the right place, so I can now lock them in place. I had to cut some small angled spacers to pack out the bars on the left hand side. Now I turn my attention to the support rails that keep the base in place. And like any other large scale project, the workshop was in such a state it was just easy to cut these by hand. This rail, which will take the majority of the weight of the planer, is the offcut from the 1.5 by 6 I cut down earlier, and each end received 2 pocket hole screws. Then it was fixed between the bars using a piece of the 1x4 as a packer. The next 2 components to be fitted are the underguides for the planer base. The front one here is only temporary and will be removed later. Let's slide in the planer base and make sure it runs. Excellent, that seems to work perfectly. Now I can drop the planer in place just to ensure that there's no clashes. Yes, so far that looks good, although it's a little front heavy, so at the moment I can't let it go. Okay, let's crack on with the front face. First of all, I made this bearer the width of the frame. Using pocket hole screws, because of the larger head, screwed 2 casters to the bearer. The front frame is constructed exactly like the planer bed frame, inch by 4, clamped together and pocket hole screwed. The bearer with the casters on is then screwed to the rear of this frame. With the casters sitting on the floor, I can now offer the front frame up to the planer bed and mark the height, and then return it to the bench and fit the top rail. I then fit the frame to the planer bed with a couple of screws. That seems to run okay. Now for a couple of stiffening brackets. So back to the table saw, where I cut some more inch by 4 down into inch by 2s. And with the planer perched on the half built cart, I regularised the width. So it's a perfect day in the loft. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's quiet outside, and I've got the radio on. So why not enjoy this and make these Gallow brackets by hand? First, using my marking gauge, I mark out the 90-degree corner. And then, with my tenon saw and my chisel, cut away the waste. I don't often get to use my shoulder plane, so it's a nice little run out for it. And once the half lap is complete, I turn my attention to the 2 45-degree joints. Using the square to ensure the frame stays square, I mark out the diagonals and transfer over the half laps with my small square. Cut the stock to length, then mark round the joint with my marking gauge. Cut down the cheek of the half lap and clean up using my shoulder plane. I decide to make the half lap with a dovetail shape. In theory this should be stronger, but mainly I was just enjoying cutting the joints. This was then cut out using my bench bull. So the geometry looks like this. Now I can transfer the dovetails over to the opposite side of the half lap. And again cut out the joint with my tenon saw and chisel. Right, let's glue it up. I'm using a couple of pieces of plywood here to stop the thing sticking to the bench. I first fit the cross brace and then, with the aid of a clamp, tap the half lap into position. And once the glue is dried, I reinforce the joint with a dowel. Well, I was going to use a dowel, but it turned out once I drilled the holes I didn't have any. But I had these walnut pocket hole infills, so I figured they'd do the job as they wedge against each other when you knock them in with the hammer, and maybe also look cool. Once these were dry, I cut them off with my trim saw and flush cut the end of the half laps. And using some 100 grit, give the whole thing a good sand up. Right, back under the bench. Removed the front guide I put on earlier and made another and turned them both 90 degrees. Then back at the bench with the planer base, started to fit the 2 Gallow brackets. These are glued and screwed with some 50mm screws. And the front bearer is fitted in the same manner. The base can now be slid into the bars under the bench. the excess length is cut away from the front frame. Before I finally fit the front frame, I want to drill some doggles in the face. For this I use my Axminster Path Guide jig. And then apply some glue to the top of the front frame and to the uprights in the gallow bracket. Apply some clamps to hold the frames together. And then drill and screw the frame on. Without doing myself some damage, it's now time to fit the planer. Now I don't want to permanently fit the planer to this bench. This is because it's not quite set in the centre of the workshop, so sometimes I may want to just pop it off this frame and onto my bench top. So now I have the final positioning, I just use the last of the framing pieces I made earlier. Again, just clamped and pocket screwed. So to keep the planer skating around on top of the bench, I've made this little returning section that sits at the back. This is cut out on the bandsaw. And then it's screwed tight to the back of the planer. For lateral restraint, two small pieces of wood are screwed down the length, one each side. So the planer is captive but not permanently fixed. And the last thing to do is just finish off the doggles in the face. If you're wondering what these are for, I just think it's a good idea not to waste any space in such a small shop. It provides me with additional clamping options, such as the glue bars I made in an earlier project. So that's it. Finally, the last piece of equipment as a home. When not in use, it sits nicely within the bench, and when I need to use it, I can just pull it out into the centre of the workshop. And it provides the added benefit I can no longer clutter up this part of the worktop.